Welcome, Dr. Epic here. And in this lecture, we're going to learn about an ancient town and stone knives and trophy skulls and missing persons and hungry wolves. We're going to follow that outline right up above my head and address one of the ancient mysteries of the American West. Who killed Crow Creek? And to build an answer to this mystery, you're going to unleash the power of forensic anthropology and apply what you've learned about antemortem trauma and perimortem trauma and postmortem trauma and biological identity, biological age, biological sex, the effects of tools and weapons on human bone, and what animals do to untended human remains. Now, with this massacre at Crow Creek, when you're trying to solve this mystery, it's always easier to take a big question and break it into a bunch of little questions. And write these questions down in your notes and keep these questions bubbling in the back of your brain as we move through both the archaeological data and the forensic analysis. And these questions are: what is the sequence of events at Crow Creek? What happened there? Who is missing? And most likely, what happened to them? Who killed Crow Creek? What is Crow Creek? Crow Creek is the modern name for an ancient Native American town located in the northern parts of the Great Plains, inside what today we call the state of South Dakota. Now, the ancient town itself was triangular in shape, with two sides of the triangle being tall cliffs. And the third side, the short side of the triangle, as you can see in the map right up above me, was a large earthen wall, and on the other side of the wall was this huge ramp. So this was, in fact, a fortified town, with the sides of the cliff and the wall protecting the inhabitants of the town from the dangers of the Great Plains. Now, the site of Crow Creek itself had been first discovered in the 1950s, but it really wasn't investigated until the 1970s, because in the 1970s, the Army Corps of Engineers was concerned that the waterway, Crow Creek itself, was actually eroding the base of the cliffs, and they were afraid that the entire ancient town might collapse. So they were looking at launching stabilization efforts, but before they could do any kind of actual large-scale engineering, they asked archaeologists to come in and investigate the town itself, so that they could actually know what was actually inside this ancient town. And the archaeologists began to excavate in and around the fortifications and inside the town itself. And right about there, as they started to dig in the fortified moat that was supposed to protect the town, they uncovered the layers of earth to discover an enormous pile of human remains. A single dense layer, something that is known archaeologically as a bone bed. They peeled back the earth to find the human remains of the ancient inhabitants of Crow Creek. And there they are, piled together in a single huge mass grave, the result of a single massacre, a large-scale event that ended the occupation of this ancient town. As the bodies of inhabitants were piled into and hastily buried inside the moat that was supposed to protect them. The forensic analysis of these human remains took the better part of a decade, and part of that data you can see there on the left. And one of the things that became apparent very quickly is that in this huge bone bed, there were not 486 skeletons, but rather it was just a huge dense pile of body parts. The skeletons were incomplete. There were large numbers of missing bones, but not all of the bones were equally missing. Some were more present than others. And here, right up above me, I've listed the bones that are particularly missing, that are particularly noteworthy. For instance, there's 486 individuals. There should be 486 skulls, but there weren't. There were a large number of missing skulls. There were only 392 skulls documented inside that bone bed. 94 heads were missing from the mass grave. And we see the same thing with arms and legs. 367 femora were present. 119 of them are absent. 200 humeri are present, the bone of the upper arm. 286 of them are absent. There's 269 tibiae were documented inside the mass grave. 217 of them were absent. The same thing with the ulna, one of the bones of the lower arm. 113 of them were documented. 373 of them were absent. In other words, there were large numbers of missing arms and legs. And even more particularly interesting were hands and feet. Almost all of the hands and feet were missing from the mass grave. Look at the data at the bottom. They only documented 44 hand phalanges. There should be over 13,000 of these bones. They only found 44 of them. In other words, 99.7% of the hands are gone. They're just missing. And the greatest disparity was again found with feet. There should be over 13,000 foot phalanges present in this mass grave. There's 486 individuals and they all have toes. So there should be over 13,000 toes. There weren't. 11 foot phalanges were recovered from the mass grave. Large numbers of missing bones. Missing heads, missing arms, missing legs, missing hands, missing feet. In a normal human population, you should have a nice sort of bell-shaped curve in terms of age and sex. You should have a few children, you should have a few elderly people, and you should have a large number of adults, roughly evenly divided between male and female. Normal human populations generally have like 51 or 52% female to 48, 49% male. This is not what came out of the mass grave at Crow Creek. The population as represented in the mass grave resembles no known human population. In this huge pile of dead, they're almost entirely children. A significant number of the individuals inside the mass grave are aged 14 years or younger. In fact, there's 152 individuals. 46% of the total dead inside the mass grave at Crow Creek are children. 46% of our population should not be under 14 years of age. A second cluster was found, which consisted of adult men. 74 individuals, or basically 22% of the total bodies recovered from that event, are adult men aged 15 to 34. And the third cluster, the third largest cluster of individuals from the bone bed were old women. Older women aged 40 years or higher. This was 47 individuals, roughly 14% of the population. There is absolutely no way this is an accurate representation of the inhabitants of this ancient town. There is no known human society. There's 46% children, 22% adult men, and 14% old women. In other words, there are people missing. There are critical population segments missing from the dead of Crow Creek. There's people that are just missing. Who is missing? There are almost no young women in that mass grave. They're just missing. They're gone. There's almost no adult women aged between, say, 15 and 40. There's almost no women inside the mass grave. The only women there are the old women. And there's no old men. There's no elderly men. There's almost no women of childbearing age found inside the mass grave, hastily buried in the moat of the ancient town. So there's people missing. All of the bones show evidence of perimortem trauma. Some of them show very dramatic evidence of perimortem trauma, like these two bones right up above me. If you look there on the left, that is the proximal end of a femur. And you'll notice there is a cut right about there. That is a slash that is on the outside of this of the proximal end of the left femur. And you can see somebody sliced into the outside of this person's outer leg, sliced through the flesh, and deeply cut into the outer edge of the bone itself. And we'll come back to this bone in a bit, but there's also a bit of antemortem trauma present there. Remember that, because we'll come back to it. Now, if you look at the bone right up above me, that's a C2 vertebra. That's one of the key vertebra in the upper spine inside the neck. But you'll see there is a huge cut across the front of that C2 vert. Right there, there is evidence of a cut. In other words, to get that cut, and that's perimortem trauma. So that is occurred while the bone was alive. You can tell that by the sharp edges of the trauma of the insult. So to get a cut like that on the front of your C2 vertebra, somebody took a knife and cut through this person's throat, through the blood vessels, through the muscles, through the organs, to scrape their knife along the front of that neck bone. That is some serious trauma. It is, of course, a lethal injury. And an analysis of this insult to bone, an analysis of what caused this kind of trauma, basically would be a mix of flint arrowheads, semi-pointed clubs, and stone knives. Some of the remains were actually burned. So the village burned at some point, and some of these bodies were exposed to flame. The forensic anthropologists looked at various museums, and they looked at what could have caused this type of injury. And what they eventually settled on were stone knives, much not too dissimilar from that modern replica you see there on the lower left. So that is the type of knife that was used to cause these injuries, that cut along the top of this one person's thigh, that slashed this one person's throat straight through to the bone. And again, on various crania, you have these star-shaped impacts to the bone, these things that struck the cranium, created these impressions, and left a star-shaped pattern on the skull. And again, the anthropologists went into museums and they talked to Native Americans, and eventually they attempted to recreate that kind of trauma using some of these museum weapons. And they were able to do that. And the weapon that causes this kind of trauma is located right up above my little yellow box. It's called a Great Plains War Club. And what they are is a heavy piece of wood. And at one end of this piece of wood is this kind of double pointed blunt stone. And the whole thing is wrapped very tightly in bison leather. And it forms this very formidable weapon that actually has a great deal of flexibility to it. So it actually kind of snaps forward like a whip when it's deployed. And they took a number of bones and they struck them with replicas of these museum weapons. And it created the exact same type of injury as you see from these photographs from the remains found at Crow Creek. In addition, a large number of these skulls possessed a very unusual type of trauma. And you can see it on the frontal bone of the cranium right up above me. You can see, those curved bits are the orbits of the eyes. And you can see those scratch marks. That's the result of a stone knife cutting across the front of the cranium. And you can see it very similarly there on the upper left. Parallel cut marks in a row right on the front, on the forehead, in the frontal part of the cranium. And I want you to think what type of activity associated with Native Americans would create this type of trauma, where someone is, for instance, grabbing onto somebody's hair and making about a dozen cuts across their forehead. And I am, of course, referring to scalping, where you hold an individual down, cut across their forehead, grab their hair, and if you've done this correct, with one pull, you could pull most of their scalp completely off of their heads. Scalps were a type of trophies, but the Native Americans of the Great Plains also just used skulls as trophies as well. And again, a large number of these individuals were scalped, and a large number of them were decapitated. And as you can see from the decapitation data there on the lower left, a large number of these individuals were scalped. A large number of individuals were in fact decapitated. Both sexes and all ages were in fact scalped. And it's not just perimortem trauma that you see on these bones. There is also a massive amount of antemortem trauma. These people lived very rough lives before they were killed with the massacre at Crow Creek. So there is significant antemortem trauma present on these remains. If you look right up above me, these are ulnas that were recovered from the bone bed. These are knotted, twisted ulnas. Large numbers of adult men had perifractures on their ulnas. These are, of course, defensive wounds that we discussed in the previous lecture. And there is frequent reshaping of the nasal bones and of the zygomatic arches. So a lot of these men had been punched in the face a large number of times. These people lived very, very rough lives. There is significant violence present in this society, which is probably why they lived in a fortified town on the sides of a cliff. Now there's some really horrifying stuff. At least 3 of the skulls recovered from the bone bed show evidence of ante-mortem scalping. Now, I described scalping earlier, but one of the more horrifying things about scalping is that you can actually survive it. And we know this because people in the Old West did in fact survive being scalped. Like this poor guy right up above me, Robert McGee, was scalped. And what you are staring at in that photograph right up above me is his exposed cranial vault. You can actually survive being scalped. You're not going to live very well, and that bone is going to be subject, it's going to be really vulnerable to infection. And you've got to take a lot of care if you want to live past this, but it's not impossible. And if you do live for a number of years after being scalped, your bone acquires a kind of pitted roughness to it that looks just like that photograph in the upper left. So 3 of these individuals had been scalped while they were alive and had survived a number of years after being scalped. This was a very violent society. These people lived very rough lives. There was a lot of danger out on the Great Plains of the 14th century. And all of this ante-mortem trauma indicates that these individuals possessed very rough life histories. And this is almost certainly the result of intense endemic warfare on the Great Plains. And this gives us an important clue. All of this ante-mortem trauma can basically tell us what happened to one of these missing groups of people. It should be able to tell you should be able to figure this out, why there are no old men in the mass grave at Crow Creek. And if you can't think about it, contemplate it. The answer should come to you. In addition to ante-mortem and perimortem trauma, there is also significant postmortem trauma. So for at least a period, all of these human remains were just lying on the surface of the earth for at least some time. And we know this because there is significant animal treatment of these bones. That is the proximal end of the femur that we saw earlier. And there is the perimortem slash, but also on the femoral head is the postmortem animal marks. Specifically animal damage to the femoral heads and epiphyses of the long bones. There again, there's another proximal end of a femur right up above me, and you can see the chew marks, those little holes and cavities. Those are chew marks caused by canines. So if you fed a canine some bones and you pulled the bones away from the canine, if you could, it would produce marks that look almost identical to that. And these are canines with very large teeth. So what animal does this suggest? And also, this should solve one of the little mysteries of the missing bones from the bone bed. Since we know these animals are present, it should explain why we're missing certain skeletal elements. So, you should have all of the evidence you need to rebuild the sequence of events at Crow Creek, to explain what happened to these people before they ended up in this mass grave. And to give you a hint, there's 2 and at least 3 groups of Native Americans involved. And you may not know exactly the identity of the people who were killed at Crow Creek, or the identity of the people who killed them, but you should have a pretty good idea of what happened at Crow Creek based on the powers of forensic anthropology. And also, this is giving you a hint at the next section as we move full bore into another subset of anthropology itself, archaeology. And I will see you there.